Okay, thank you to everyone who has signed up and is attending this panel discussion on the question, what is digital fashion? My name is Michael Spicher. I am one of the 3 co-editors for a book on digital fashion for Bloomsbury Academic that will come out spring 2024. I'm also a philosopher who writes and teaches on beauty and aesthetics. And I've been working on articles on digital fashion and the metaverse more broadly. And I teach in Boston, Massachusetts at Massachusetts College of Art and Design and also Boston Architectural College. And with me today is Afsha Iragorri and Dani Loftus. And we'll begin by having them introduce themselves with what they do, but also how they got involved in digital fashion in the first place. So I guess, Afsha, if you wanted to start.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So hello, everyone. My name's Afsha. I'm the co-founder and head of 3D technical design at 3D Fashion Solutions. A lot of people in the 3D fashion community also know me for the 3D work that I've done with Browseware. I got interested in digital fashion at my first job that I got fresh out of graduating with a BFA in fashion design from Mass College of Art and Design. The company was called Coldwater Creek, and I worked on a technical design team there. They were just like starting to dip their toes into 3D with Browseware vStitcher. And that's when I had my first training in the software. I instantly fell in love with it, and I just couldn't believe how efficient it made like the design and fit process. So after Coldwater, I worked for Ralph Lauren for a year, and they too were in the process of training some teams in the software. They were also using Browseware. 3D fashion didn't become like a full-time job for me until I was hired at Calvin Klein to build out their sleepwear and underwear blocks. And then since then, I've been working on my own business, which offers 3D, like various 3D fashion services to brands. And I also help Browseware part-time as a 3D specialist.
Thank you so much. And Dani?
Amazing. So I am a digital fashion founder, influencer, and investor. So I began in the space with a content platform called This Outfit Does Not Exist back in January of 2021. I then moved in to join an organization called Red DAO. And what we do as part of this DAO is we are a collection of members who put money and also our time and our resources together to further the digital fashion ecosystem. So that's through venture style investments in digital fashion businesses. It's through picking up items from specific digital fashion collections. And then we're also rolling out increasingly education initiatives because this space is so early and it's so important to really help people understand what digital fashion is and why it's so exciting to engage, which is obviously exactly what we're doing on this panel today. And then finally, in somewhere between January and July of last year, I founded a platform called Drop, which is still in stealth at the moment. And Drop is a platform to maximize the value of digital fashion for creators and consumers. So we're going to be launching at the beginning of next year. It's going to have a marketplace, and it's also going to allow assets to be fully interoperable and monetized. So that's one of the things that I'm working on at the moment. And I got into digital fashion, I would say a relatively non-traditional way, but I think it's digital fashion, so there's nothing that traditional that anyone would do. But I grew up absolutely loving fashion and then steered away from it slightly in my university and kind of post-university years, where I ended up actually working in the social impact space. So I moved into blockchain after working for a sustainability fund back in 2018. I was then working in just the wider tech industry. So my job was going into FTSE 100 companies and saying, here's how emerging technology will disrupt the work that you do. Here's how you should respond, but totally sector agnostic, so not focused at all on fashion. And in 2020, I was just following the fashion space very closely out of my own personal interest. And I read an article where the CMO of Gucci said, we're going to start designing clothes to be worn digitally. And just a light bulb went off in my head, and I immediately understood that this was going to be the future of the 50 million large creator economy. and expected to go online and see a ton of articles written about it. And there was absolutely nothing. So it was the pandemic and I've always loved writing. So I decided to start writing these 5,000 word explainer essays on what digital fashion was and why I thought it was going to be the future, and also posting photos of myself wearing digital fashion, because at that point, nobody else was even wearing it. And, it took off in ways I could have never expected from there.
Wonderful. Wow. So before we, just one quick comment before we segue into the first official question of feel free to write, to those listening, feel free to write any questions as you think of them in the Q&A, and we'll save about 10-15 minutes at the end to go through those. So the kind of the most basic question that we could ask for some people may know this, so we can keep this part a little brief, but what is digital fashion? I mean, that's the question of the panel. I just wonder if maybe you either or both of you could talk a little bit about some of where we are right now and what it is and what it's being used for, and maybe where it came from a little bit. Either one.
I'm happy to give a kind of how I define it, and then kind of move on to either one of you around where it actually came from, because I would love to get your opinions. So for me, digital fashion falls into 3 categories. The first one I refer to as IRL, in real life digital fashion, which sounds relatively oxymoronic, but it's essentially a physical garment with a digital backend. So for me, that can encompass digital design software, but it could also be an increasing number of objects where you have a digital asset which is being sold and bought and sold as a digital item standalone, but with a physical counterpart. And we've seen brands like Artifact do this, creators like G-Money with incredible success. So that's the category 1, IRL digital fashion. Category 2, I see as ORL, on real life digital fashion. And for me, that's digital fashion that's worn on human beings. So this outfit does not exist, which I got into the space creating, was me as a human being wearing digital fashion. And I would do that initially through render. So I would send a photo of myself in to a fashion company, so Tribute Brand or DressX, and they would render, similar to Photoshop, the outfit onto me. Increasingly, we're seeing these innovations in AR. So instead of it being you sending something in and 24 to 48 hours later, you getting something back, it's much more of a real-time process. And I think that's a very exciting innovation that's going on. Mm-hmm. And then the final category is URL, unreal life digital fashion, which is fashion worn direct to avatar. So that encompasses skins and games. And I think, from my perspective, that's one of the biggest places that digital fashion came from. It's been referred to by a different term, but skins have been around for years and years and years as a really powerful signifier of identity. But increasingly, what we're also seeing is a shift in social networks, such as Meta being the most obvious one, where instead of it being digital fashion worn for gameplay, it becomes digital fashion worn in virtual social experiences. So you're not trying to complete a challenge or trying to interact with other people. And I also think we're seeing interesting stuff with people wearing digital fashion on their picture for profiles or virtual avatars, which are NFT based on Twitter. And then I'll hand it off.
Well, I think Dani covered a lot of it, but I can give maybe a little bit more information on the creation of digital fashion. So basically, my background is more of technical. So you're providing basically the patterns that you would usually use, that a factory would usually draft, that would then get cut in fabric, and then a sample would be made. That's all being done digitally now. So you're still drafting that pattern, but in a computer software, and then importing it into one of these softwares and stitching it together and then draping it on an avatar. So once the fabric physics are simulated with in the program, then you're seeing the real drape of the garment, basically, because these fabrics are tested. And in the end result, you get a 3D model of the garment. So a 3D model is created with vertices, edges, and faces. And 3D models have been around for a long time. And most people that have been working in industrial design have already been working in 3D models, so maybe digital footwear has been around longer than 3D garments have, so that's where maybe the start of digital fashion was. And then at some point we got to a place where we were like, okay, we're already creating accessories, handbags, and footwear. But most of that is just modeled. It's not really working with real physics for fabric. So now we've taken it to another level where we are able to simulate the fabric physics with the pattern and all, calculating the measurements of the body. So it's an interesting place that we've gotten to, for sure.
Yeah, and you had mentioned, Dani, in your response to that, that some of it comes from skins and video games. I was wondering if maybe either one of you could speak to the origin of digital fashion from the gaming world. How did that, because it seems like gamers knew something that the rest of the world is finding out now, 20 years later. And I can even remember video games before they were connected to the internet, where even then you had some clothing options. It was much more limited, but you could at least switch between 2 or 3 outfits, depending on what you felt, whatever you suit your preferences at the moment. But yeah, I was wondering if one of you or both of you could speak to the idea of the origin of digital fashion from the gaming world and how it sort of transitioned into something bigger.
I think it's a fascinating one because I think, first of all, I think I alluded to this slightly, but gamers do not like the word fashion. They do not see the way that they engage as digital fashion. But, on the contrary, from the advent of avatars, there have been, even in the most simplistic ways, these avatars being dressed. And I think what's very interesting is in games, you have both skins and digital fashion that you buy on marketplaces for currency, but also those that are earned. And in games like CSGO, people are spending $10,000, $2,000, etc., on a single game skin. And I think in a very similar way to fashion in the physical world, fashion is in the business of identity. We no longer consume clothes out of a physiological need to keep ourselves warm or keep ourselves dry. So it's really about, will these people around us appreciate the way that we wear, what we wear? So will they see it as a way that we stand out? Is it a way to show status? And in order to do that, you have to have these cultures that really appreciate what you're signifying. And I think what's fascinating is in games like Fortnite, where the skins have absolutely no impact on the player's gameplay. There is an entire thing called default culture, where if you are wearing the most basic or default skin you get in the game, you are actively chastised by other players. So if you go on YouTube and type in default culture, there are millions of views on videos of people shaming these defaults. And obviously this is a very intense form of cyberbullying and hyper negative, but it's also fascinating because if you look at the demographic of Fortnite, it's not the same people who are sitting in the front row of fashion shows looking people up and down for what they wear. And in fact, you'd expect people to be actively shunning that kind of behavior, and yet it's proliferated, even though if you have a better skin, it doesn't make you a better player. So I think wherever people are expressing identity, there'll be hierarchies of identity and signifiers of how you fit in or if you don't fit in. And I think whenever you have a representation of yourself in any form, fashion in some respect comes in, whether it's literally just a badge saying, I have this and you only have that. But these signifiers, I think, are present in all societies, all contexts, and all places where we are some form of representation.
That's so interesting about the default. That's one I had not heard of. One of the things that got me interested in, as a philosopher, got me interested in digital fashion is, what does it mean for it to exist? And which is what caught my eye about your initial website, The South Does Not Exist. I thought that was one of the more clever ones out there. But what got me interested is a story I read about of 2 teenage boys in the Netherlands who physically assaulted a younger boy until he logged into the video game RuneScape and his character dropped 2 items. And afterwards, one of the older boys logged in and picked up those items. And the Supreme Court of the Netherlands ruled that a robbery, not just a physical assault, had taken place. So it's sort of an interesting, I mean, digital fashion and digital objects more generally bring up very fascinating questions for law, philosophy, and other disciplines. So I guess part of my next question is, why do you think it's so, these digital assets and digital objects have become so important? And then, you know, another example is I was at some other panel discussion listening about digital fashion, and one of the panelists there said that his son, who's like roughly around the ages of 18 to 20, somewhere in that range, doesn't care at all what he looks like in the real world. But when he is online or posts a photo of himself, it matters absolutely what he's wearing. And I'm just wondering if you have any thought about why it's become so important, why the digital world has almost, for certain people, not I don't think it's everyone certainly yet, but for some people, especially younger people, why it's become so important, and almost the real world seems less important. Anyway, if you have thoughts on that.
I think a lot of people may be a little bit shy in expressing their identity in the real world, and online you're basically able to express yourself in any way that you want, more comfortably. So that probably has a lot to do with it. And there are people who maybe, you know, aren't comfortable in a social environment in real life, but they're able to build these communities for themselves in, you know, in gaming, or whether it's like an online forum or Reddit or something, they find a community for themselves there. And it's just, it's easier. You're bolder in online than you are in person. And especially with fashion, I feel like you might see something like in a, you know, in the store window and be like, wow, like I really want that dress, but it's like $5,000. It's sort of out of reach for me, you know. And then online, if you can get a similar digital garment that's going to cost you like a fraction of that, then it makes it so much more accessible. And then also maybe you don't have an occasion to wear a digital, like a garment, you know, that flashy in real life, but online, who's going to judge you if you show up to a chat room in a bedazzled like dress or something like that, you know? So it's all about like freedom of expression, in my opinion.
I do think we should restore bedazzled suits and dresses in real life, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so far both of you have mentioned identity. I guess I'm sort of curious to pursue that a little bit more further. How far can you go with identity? I mean, the cool thing is you can create digital fashion out of materials that aren't possible in the real world, like shoes that are on fire that I think I've seen you wear, Dani, and elsewhere. And you know, I joked at a talk I gave on it that I wanted someone to make me a dinner jacket made out of a storm cloud. So, you know, that offer to do that, except but on the flip side, you know, I mean, are there limitations to what we should do? Like it would make, you know, I don't think anyone would condemn someone for doing certain kind of like gender bending outfits or things like that. But what about mixing ethnicities that you don't actually have? Like how far can you push your digital identity where maybe is there a too far? If that makes sense.
Great question. I think it's a very, very interesting one. I think creating digital identities that allude to a physical experience that you have not yourself had is a very contentious thing. I think what's going to be interesting about fully digital spaces is that, for example, you can be blue, you can be green, you can iterate on your identity in a way that completely does not relate to your identity in the physical world. But I think if you're transforming your identity, which somehow in a way which gathers from somebody else's cultural context and makes you be regarded in a different way as a result of that, I think that's a little bit tenuous. But I would love to hear. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question.
It is. You know, I'm sure we're already getting to that point. I mean, it's like inclusivity is a huge topic right now in the digital fashion world, or like when it comes to avatars. So I think it's great that some companies like the digitals have been focusing on putting, you know, certain avatars over others first. So they really want to be inclusive. Like they have an avatar who has Down syndrome, and they've also, you know, been working just with so many different organizations as well. So they're heavily focused on inclusivity, and I think that's very important. Whether I think it might be, if you want to represent yourself as a different race or species or something like that, those kind of things might spark some, you know, controversy. And so it's a touchy topic, but we'll see if, you know, those kind of conflicts happen. I haven't really seen anything like that yet, but yeah.
Well, and part of the difficulty is you might not know, because if you didn't know me in real life and all of a sudden you meet my virtual extension and it's, you know, a Black woman, and you don't know that it's actually a white man behind that's where it gets a little bit possibly pernicious or bordering on or deceptive. But yeah, it's an interesting question, and this is why you know, I think this is why I think it's important to start raising some of these issues now before it becomes an actual thing. I wanted to, based on at least a couple questions in that people have asked, and also one that I had already thought of, I wanted to maybe move into, suppose someone decides, I want to make digital fashion. What do they need to learn? And I think there's two components to this question. I think there's the person that is already doing physical fashion that wants to transition to digital fashion. That may be one set of skills. And then there may be somebody that never really got into physical fashion for some reason, but sees all of a sudden that digital fashion, you know, maybe it's someone that's more technical or technological minded, sees something with digital fashion and wants to get involved in that. So there might be two kind of prongs to this, depending on where they're coming from. I mean, it might be a third, but those are at least the two broadest ones I'm thinking of. So what would you tell someone that they need to learn, or how to even get going? What programs, how to transition from physical fashion to digital fashion? You know, any one of those combinations.
I think it's not necessary to have like a background in fashion to be able to create digital fashion. As you know, like the gaming and the fashion industries have sort of started to collaborate much more now, and there are fashion brands that have employed people who are more into, you know, gaming, developing and stuff like that. And then there are fashion background people who are now creating garments for game platforms. So you definitely don't need a fashion background. It's only when you start to work with a fashion brand that you need knowledge in product development and technical design, because they're looking for a true digital twin. So like, for example, in my area, you need to know what a garment pattern looks like and how to be able to put it together. A lot of the brands that I work with, they fit in Browswear V-Stitcher. So a strong background in fit knowledge is required. But it's learning a software, it's not impossible, you know, it's just requires a learning curve and anyone's able to do it. So just if you're a gamer and you're interested in getting into digital fashion, but you want to work with brands, maybe, you know, getting some of that knowledge in garment construction is going to be really useful to you. And I can't really speak for the gaming industry, but I would imagine that fashion designers that want to get into that area, that they would need to understand the different file formats, or working with certain type of avatars. Like a Roblox avatar is nothing like a fit avatar, you know? So just being able to understand, in being able to understand how you can convert the garments that you're creating into, to be able to use them on different various like platforms and gaming systems.
Could you quickly list a couple of the most prominent softwares people use for creating and draping digital garments?
So the main one that I work with is Browseware vStitcher, and I choose to work with it because they focus heavily on being able to simulate like the fabric physics accurately. So the companies that are fitting in the program, that's very important to them. And then there are other programs like Clo 3D. There's also Style 3D. Gerber has their own 3D as for garment creation software as well. And then there are many different avatar creation softwares. And then there are programs like Blender, which, you know, are programs that more have been used more on the gaming side or on 3D modeling side, but now people in fashion are starting to learn them because they know that they can take the garment that they've stitched together in Browseware in vStitcher and put it into a 3D scene in Blender and render it out. So there are many different programs, and it's just about being able to, you know, take the time to learn them. Right now, Browseware vStitcher is offering the indie program. So until December, you can, you know, apply for their indie program. They'll give you a license. You'll have access to Browseware University. So the resources are out there for anyone who's interested in learning. And it's just about, you know, getting yourself to do it, really.
And one very brief follow-up question that someone just asked that relates to what you just said. Is there any free software that someone could use to like try it out?
Most of these softwares offer a 30-day trial, but Browseware vStitcher's indie program is free until December, and they might extend it when that deadline comes as well.
All right, cool. Sorry, Dani, if you have anything to add, or we.
I mean, I can't add, I have nothing to add in terms of actually how to make digital fashion, but I think just something very important is this industry is still being defined, and given especially that it's a Web3 native industry, interdisciplinary talent is exactly what's needed. So you know, anyone can get involved in digital fashion. There are so many avenues, and if there doesn't seem to be something, create your own. And I also think around that, there is, you know, truly a lack of centralized education, which obviously in some ways is not a good thing, but in other ways it has really led to an amazing sense of community. Yeah. And really that there is no such thing as a stupid question. These everything from the definitions of what digital fashion is to the way it's created is being defined by people in the space in real time. So nobody should ever think that they don't know enough or do not have the qualifications to enter the space.
No, and that's actually something, I mean, like, and you said anyone get involved. I'm a philosopher. I don't have a tech background or a fashion background, and I'm involved in the space. Yeah, I think you said something very important. Like, any of the people I've randomly reached out to in digital fashion have been super friendly and and everyone loves to talk about it right now. So so it's very easy to get in touch with people. Even the people that are like some of the leaders in it are usually easy to get in touch with. So it's actually a very great space to be in at the moment. One of the other questions I had, and then we'll move into start going through some of the questions that people have asked. But one of the last questions I wanted to address was, suppose someone isn't sure, like is on the fence about digital fashion, about buying their first digital garment. You know, I can imagine maybe part of the issue is, well, this thing can't keep me warm at night. This can't protect me from the rain or wind. Is it merely for entertainment? Like, what would you what reason would you give them why they might want to go for it and buy their first digital garment? And I know it depends on the person,
Dani.
possibly. But
Go ahead, Dani. You can answer first.
I mean, I think, especially at this stage, it's really to do with expression of identity. And I think what's very exciting about digital fashion is exactly as Michael alluded to. First of all, there are these amazing ways to dress and self-express that we've never seen before. But also you have the ability to access, I would say, a range of fashion at a much cheaper price point. So if you want to engage with large brands, for example, a Balenciaga item in the physical world would be thousands of dollars. The skin they did for Fortnite, I believe, was only $12. So that allows you to buy in, and also supporting emerging designers, people making these one-of-ones, which is the equivalent of haute couture in the physical world. Mm-hmm. And you can engage with them and support them and be part of their journey. And I think the NFT space has gotten into a lot of trouble, partially because it's been characterized as this quick route for making money that's now crashed. And I really don't believe in that. I believe it's this amazing way to engage with digital goods, engage with creators, have these people receive fair reimbursement. And I think the places you can wear it, yes, you have Instagram at the moment. Yes, in certain cases you have games, but they'll expand with time. But right now you have the ability to participate in a piece of history and self-express in entirely new ways. And for me, that's why it's so exciting.
I think it's important to know that digital fashion really isn't just for entertainment purposes, although on the entertainment side, it's about creating a digital identity, like Dani mentioned, whether it's for your Bitmoji or like your Memoji, or even for like a gaming avatar. We're like also in the early stages of virtual try-ons, which many companies are investing a lot of resources into right now. So from the comfort of your home, you're going to be able to determine whether a garment suits you or not before purchasing it. A customer may not necessarily be aware, but digital fashion also allows for brands to meet the consumer demand on getting better fashion faster in a more sustainable manner. So essentially, it's like a win-win for all. And then it's also a form of investment in some cases in the area of digital art ownership. Like you mentioned, the NFTs, there's a lot of pushback on that. And I do agree that the buyer needs more assurance that it's a worthy purchase, but the industry is still experimenting with it right now and trying to figure that piece out.
Yeah, and just a quick plug, since you mentioned sustainability, we won't get into that too much today because we're doing a whole panel, part of Boston Fashion Week, this Friday, October 14th at 12 p.m. So if you haven't registered, go do that now or after we finish here. So moving into some of these, you had mentioned price, Dani, and if someone saw in, I believe, late 2019, a particular digital dress selling for $9,500, they might think, well, digital fashion isn't for me because I can't afford that either. I believe Gucci had a handbag for $4,000 somewhat recently. But what's the basic price range for digital fashion? And yeah, and I know that it's probably a tough question because it might be the same as like physical fashion, where you could buy a shirt for $5 or 10,000. But
I think that's the unfortunate thing. So you have, obviously, as I said, you have these digital goods with very, very low price points, such as $2, $3, $4, $5. But then you have on the other end of the spectrum, for example, Artifact, which is this very well-known digital fashion brand for being, I would say, the most notable digital fashion acquisition yet. So they were three guys who previously worked at Fnatic, who then created a digital sneaker brand. They got acquired by Nike last year. And if you look at their OG sneakers, they're going for, check now, they're going for hundreds of thousands of dollars. I think what is different is the paradigm of what holds value is different. So you haven't seen this direct translation where, okay, if Gucci or Balenciaga has made something, it's going to immediately be worth a lot of money. I think people are still looking for what value is and what brand and cultural signifiers are in this market and in this specific vertical of fashion. And so there are really exciting ways to engage with young new designers. And also, you're much more likely that the people that you're backing are going to be the future of fashion instead of the system that we exist in currently, which has very high moats, very high barriers to entry for young creators. And it's almost impossible for young brands to break in.
Let's see. Well, someone asked, this is kind of maybe a fun question. Why aren't you wearing digital clothes right now?
It's a great question. I mean, it's for me. So it's interesting because Snap actually a while ago partnered with, I believe it was Teams, to allow certain pieces of their digital fashion to become wearable. I think the reason that I am not wearing real-time digital fashion on this call is whilst we've had incredible advancements in AR, and for example, there's a company called 010 that I work with who really have been doing phenomenal things in body tracking, it's still not perfect. And so you have clothes which can glitch or arm can come off. And I think in order for digital fashion to move forward, and it will be in the next couple of years, none of that can happen. And at that point, you'll see the higher regularity of wear. And I think a final interesting point to mention around that is, if you look at what I'm wearing now, you can't see below, my shoulders. So I think when people start designing digital fashion optimized for Zoom, they have this much to work with. So I think we're going to see an entire new class of garments designed exactly for that purpose.
When you had mentioned that like arms move, like missing, like the clothing doesn't move with the person's arm, from what I understand, the technology at the moment is much better for someone's head than it is for the rest of their body. Like a hat or glasses will move, or earrings will move a little bit more seamlessly than the rest of their body. So I think it seems like, and I even remember when Spicher first came out, all of the avatars were legless, and then they just within the last 6 months or so, they added legs to the avatars, because I guess people have said that legs are among the hardest thing to get to look natural as far as a digital thing, not as a character like an animation, but as far as like a live avatar. What do you feel the natural progression of digital fashion will be as the Web3 landscape evolves? And I assume, the word some people would use would be the metaverse. So what do you think will happen? What do you think the natural progression of it will be? And I think some of the things you've already said allude to this, but maybe this helps bring it all together.
I mean, for me, everything will be on chain. And the reason that I think everything needs to be on chain is the digital fashion that I started with and the digital fashion that also exists in game. You as a consumer are buying it, and the average Fortnite consumer spends something like $180 per year on their digital fashion, but it doesn't actually belong to you. So you have this digital item you've invested money in, and yes, you can wear it often in a specific environment, but monetization, so whether or not you can resell it, is capped. So Fortnite, for example, doesn't allow resale. Roblox allows resale on certain items. When you're doing digital render, you're literally paying for a photo of yourself in that garment. And being on-chain fully facilitates this. Secondly, you need full ownership. So if, let's say, Fortnite went out of fashion, or there was, the platform went bust, you would lose all of your digital assets. They wouldn't actually belong to you. And also there should be these abilities to modify your assets and really have the freedom that you do with physical clothes. And for me, fashion being on chain is an absolutely crucial part of that. So for me, that's one of the biggest natural developments. And we've already started seeing it, but I think will become just utterly commonplace across the entire digital fashion landscape.
Could you just explain the expression on chain?
Yeah, of course. So for something to be on chain means that it's been minted onto a blockchain. And a blockchain is essentially an immutable ledger where if you have something stored on the blockchain, you cannot reverse it because transactions known as blocks are created on top of it. And it's held by you in something called your wallet. So it has self-custody. So instead of being controlled by a centralized entity, such as, let's say, things on the Fortnite platform or things on Meta's marketplace are owned by those corporates. The assets are actually owned by you as the consumer.
Yeah, so in other words, for some of the games that you were describing, like you own the thing in that universe, but you can't take it outside of the universe. And that seems to be a big problem that that right now people are still working to resolve. You know, the being able to like actually own a garment and bring it with you in whatever virtual space that you are in.
I think it's interesting. Dani's background, hearing about it will, you know, there are just so many like branches in digital fashion. So it's interesting to like speak with people that come from those different branches. And my side is so heavily focused on like, you know, garment like production and stuff like that, and just the cycle of a garment. So for me, I feel like in the distant like future, I think brands are gonna, right now technologies companies are focusing on being able to create you know, like basically machines that will scan your body, and then I think in the future those machines will be able to calculate your body measurements and immediately weave you a pattern based on your measurements, and it will be custom fit to you, and it's going to just make fashion so much more accessible in that way. So that's the future that I am most excited about, and it's just interesting to see how many companies are investing so much in this right now. So I know a lot of people think digital fashion is just like a fad and it's going to disappear, but it's really not that. It's not the case. It's like a revolution for us in this industry right now, and everyone is working in it, and anyone that's not is going to really fall behind, and they're not going to be able to work as efficiently as the companies that have transitioned into the 3D workflow.
Thank you. Trying to look at here. How would you advise someone who isn't digitally gifted to create their own digital designs, and what's the best way to learn about this space?
Can you ask that again? I'm sorry.
How would you advise someone who is not digitally gifted? So I mean, that's pretty wide. That could have wide ramifications. But to create their own digital designs, what's the best way to begin to learn about this space?
You have limitless resources free to you online. I mean, there's just so much available to you on YouTube. I think practice really does make perfect. And even now, sometimes I'm up until 6 a.m. trying to teach myself something new, you know, so it's about investing time into it. And also, I understand you do need a good computer. So when you're starting out in 3D fashion or 3D modeling or anything, you need to make that investment in the beginning, which could cost you between $1,500 to $3,000, depending on how powerful of a computer that you want. But it has so much return. Like if you spend the following 2 weeks after if you're a student and you're struggling because you're paying off your student debt and all of that, if you spend the following 2 weeks just learning a 3D program, I guarantee you, and you put your work out there on LinkedIn or on social media, I guarantee you that you're going to start getting requests for freelance work, or you're going to start getting interviews and with fashion brands and things like that. So it requires a lot of resources from you, like your time and maybe a little bit money, but I think the return is huge.
And sort of a related question, but more about the job side of it is, you know, someone asks, and this may be a misconception. I'm curious to hear what you both say. Opportunities in digital fashion are limited currently. What are your thoughts about the employment space in digital fashion?
So, I mean, I think, so you have two routes, right? You have a route where you go and work for a digitally native company, so digital fashion startup or a game. I've seen some amazing job titles that I'd never heard of before, like creative directors of metaverses coming out. And then you have the second option where you go and work for large brands. And I think whether or not it's being publicized, I know for a fact that every single large brand is figuring out how to engage with virtual spaces. And a lot of them currently are engaging maybe through contractors or being a little bit more experimental, but it's an absolute inevitability that they bring more companies in-house and more, they have entire in-house teams. You know, LVMH has invested a lot in it, Gucci, same thing. So I think those employment opportunities increasing in number are inevitability. And I would say a very similar thing about, you know, digital fashion startups. I think there is this tie to the, you know, wider crypto market and the hype around metaverse. And I think this next year might be tenuous for certain companies, but inevitably, you know, digital fashion is an inevitability, and more job opportunities are going to spring up. And if you are one of the people with the skill set or the resources, you really become a unicorn, you really become very, very special, and you will definitely find work. You know, from the time that I started, I've seen, you know, creators who just began with a couple of hundred followers working with some of the largest brands because their skills are so in demand. And I think it's a really unique time to get into the space.
Well, and kind of with what you said about all these big brands, you know, if people know a little bit about digital fashion and hear about companies like DressX or The Fabricant, it might be surprising I was surprised to learn this, and I know some of this stuff, that the brand that sold the most digital fashion last year or made the most profit off of it was Nike.
Of course, they have Artifact. Artifact has by far the highest amount of fans, is by far the most successful digital fashion company that we've seen. I think The Fabricant and DressX are far earlier. And I think part of the reason for that, I've always thought, is that they really knew their market. Artifact. They went for sneakerheads, and there is a quite substantial overlap between sneakerheads and crypto bros. Yeah. So it's far easier to not only capture a market, but capture a market where people were willing to spend, than it is still at this point for creators of, let's say, more general digital fashion. But I think, you know, DressX and The Fabricant we're really going to see blooming over the next couple of years, especially as wearability becomes more commonplace.
I think it's also like two powerhouses coming together, you know, so their Artifact had their own following and Nike has a whole very loyal following as well. So both of them coming together, of course, they're going to be the most successful. But from what I've seen, what The Fabricant is doing and DressX, it's also pretty incredible how fast they've been able to grow. So I do think it's an unfair comparison, really. I just think time will tell, really. And I think we're going to see many more new names as well pop up along with them.
I wanted to ask about, where do you, I know this is sort of a broad question, but where do you see, you know, you both have said digital fashion is not going away. So where do you think the next phase of it is going to be? You know, like in the next, like you had said, I think something a couple of years, Dani, things like those, some of those glitches will be over. We won't have those anymore. And but where do you see the next phase of it going, the next couple of years and maybe beyond?
I think immediately companies are going to focus heavily on 3D marketing content. So like just last week when I was in New York, I saw digital billboards of Versace, like a 3D bag, you know, so and they're very stimulating. Like I looked at it longer than I would at a normal marketing campaign, you know, so it also is so much cheaper for them to do rather than hiring a photographer, videographer for a whole week and then all the editing process that goes into that. It's also time. So something like that could take a few hours rather than a few weeks to put together and cost a fraction of the price that it would. if you had to hire a photographer and videographer and put a whole set together and things like that. So I think immediately that's what fashion companies are going to focus on, and they already are. So it's all about the marketing content, and there's just so much really that they're going to focus on, but that's what I see them looking more at right now.
Yeah, and I think, from my perspective, it's also going to be around defining who the wearer is, because I think it's a very different type of person who does IRL versus ORL versus URL. And I think as we become more comfortable with forms of ourselves, which I see as created from nothing, so created as an avatar rather than curated from moments in our physical lives, what digital fashion is will also respond to that in very interesting ways.
And then kind of as like a final question related to sort of this future looking idea, and this is good, I'm going to admit this takes us slightly outside of digital fashion by itself, but I'm just curious, from your perspective from digital fashion, if you see something here, what benefit do you think these 3D spaces that some people might refer to as the metaverse, some people might just refer to as Web3, immersive online experiences, other than gaming, obviously, that we know that part already, but what benefit do you think that will provide for people? This is just a speculative question. I'm just curious what you think of it, because it does really, because as you said, like if you're in those spaces, you're going to want to dress yourself in some particular way. But I'm wondering, maybe a more basic question, why engage in those spaces in the first place? And obviously not in the gaming context, because that's a whole different reason.
I think it's a little bit silly when people say, oh, who would want to live in the metaverse? I mean, you already are interacting in it. You're sending emails, you're chatting with people, that your day-to-day work is online. So that's still the metaverse. People think you have to be in AR to be considered to be in the metaverse, so that's a little bit funny to me, but I'm not sure if everyone will be on board with attending virtual events and dressing themselves, but I'll have to see where that goes.
Well, all the movies make digital worlds seem negative. So, anyway, if you had a thought on that too, Dani.
I think it's very interesting, because I think we're just going to see increasing amounts of cultural moments happen in fully virtual spaces. And so if your friends are in there, if there's increasing art, music, culture, you're going to be participating as well. And I think obviously it's this extension of the fact that, exactly as we were just discussing, you're already spending hours and hours and hours and hours in a virtual space. It's just a virtual space where you're bringing more of your physical identity into it. So I think we're already comfortable.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, of course, being inside like the Roman Colosseum or the Sistine Chapel, of course, being there physically, I don't know that anyone would argue that it's better in the virtual space, but sometimes people don't always have that option. Although there are some advantages of virtual spaces, even in those things, where you can maybe zoom into some high up thing that you wouldn't be able to reach otherwise, because I'm sure you're not allowed to bring a ladder or scaffolding into the Sistine Chapel to get a closer look, so there could be some advantages like that, of course, but you won't, right now we're sort of limited to sight and sound, but I've been, maybe either of you know more about this than I do, specifics, but I've heard that some people are beginning to work on ways of creating smell so that you can be in a virtual world and smell things, and stuff. So it's not impossible. I know that there's gloves you can wear where you can kind of get some sort of sensation, or that they're working on them. We can get some sort of sensation. So anyway, with that, I just want to give you the opportunity if you have any final words for everybody, and then we'll close out.
I just want to say, thank you to Michael and everyone for attending. I am always advocating for people to not be afraid of jumping into the digital fashion world. So Definitely from like the information you've gathered today and from your own research, just jump into it. Like don't wait until next week. Don't hold it off for another month. Like start getting into it.
Totally. I would echo that completely. I don't think I could have put it better.
Thank you, Afsha and Dani, for your time and for participating in Boston Fashion Week's first panel on digital fashion. And with that, thank you all for attending.